Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be part 2 of my nonfiction November wrap-up. There'll be a third, but probably sometime in January, which I'm going to mix with some other things because I've got a theme that's maybe going on. I'm going to start with the most depressing and work our way down, maybe. So I listened to the audio version of Maria Campbell's Halfbreed. This book, if you are not familiar with it, is basically a classic of Canadian Indigenous writing. It is the author's memoir of her childhood growing up Métis and poor in the 1940s and 50s, and then her early adulthood. She was someone whose family was essentially forced into poverty by the government. The Métis people did not have the hunting rights that at least First Nations people had, so her father would be sent to prison for hunting out of season, even though this was their traditional activity, which meant that fall deeper and deeper into poverty. She was at one point raped by an RCMP officer that was looking for her father. She was married off at 15 because that was the only way that she could keep her younger siblings out of foster care. Her life story is kind of a litany of tragedies, but tragedies that all trace back to mistreatment by the system, essentially. When this was published in 1973, it was one of the first of its kind, not the first, but really one of the. And I had first actually heard about this at a panel a few years ago at the Festival of Literary Diversity, where a group of Indigenous authors were talking about what was the first Indigenous writer that you became aware of. And virtually all of them who were between the ages of 30 and 55 all named this book. And some of them talked about how their mothers had it hidden under a mattress. And that was Tanya Talaga's story, I think, actually. And so it was really interesting how it existed in the cultural space. Campbell herself narrates the audio version and has a very almost matter-of-fact tone to it. And it reminded me a lot of when you talk to somebody on the bus and you're stuck somewhere in the snow and they tell you a long story about their life. And it felt a lot like that. So I thought that was incredibly charming, and not charming. I thought that was an incredibly powerful way to take in the story. So yeah, this was definitely worth it for the historical context, both because it had such an influence on so many other younger generations of writers, but also because there was a tendency, I think, with some settler Canadians, if you will, to act as though none of this information had been out there until the past 10 years, when clearly this came out in 1973, and generations have come of age between. So I think it's important for the historical context, but also worthwhile for the story itself. But be prepared, it is gutting, and there is a lot of domestic abuse and obviously abuse of the system, actual abuse of people, domestic abuse, the whole picture. But absolutely worth reading, and absolutely gutting as well. And because nothing can compare to that, I'm just going to switch to a completely different style of book. Next up, I read The Innocence of Objects, which is almost like a souvenir book for the Museum of Innocence, the actual museum, not Orhan Pamuk's novel of the same name. This includes art, pictures of displays that are in the museum itself, and explanations of the character. The main character in the novel was based on one of the author's friends, and there are discussions with him and generational pieces. And just, if you have any pack rats in your life who were alive and have nostalgia for the 50s and 60s especially, although to a certain extent to the 70s as well, this is the kind of book that you could very easily give them as a gift that I think they'd appreciate and that I think you would enjoy just looking through it. There's one page and it's all ceramic dogs, and I think my grandparents had at least one of those exact models, things like that. So absolutely pack rats who remember that time, especially if they're from northwestern Turkey, but I think anywhere in the Mediterranean, the material culture would have been really similar, and I think this is just absolutely fascinating. And special sounds cheesy, but genuinely looking through it, I thought it's like looking through somebody else's nostalgia journal, and that's just fantastic. I thought that's amazing, and it would make, and being kind of a coffee table book, I do think it'd be a great gift for the pack rats in your life who talk about the stuff they had in the 50s or 60s. Good stuff. Next up, let's talk about some comics. I read Nate Powell's Save It for Later. Nate Powell was the artist on John Lewis's March series about the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. And this book is essentially Powell discovering from his work on that project some of the structural inequalities in the United States and trying to figure out how he can talk about that with his children as a middle-class white Anglo man. This is primarily a meditation of things from the rise of Donald Trump's presidency through to the first part of the pandemic. And it's interesting in the sense of you get to follow him along as he's trying to work these things out for himself. But in parts it's frustrating because I think a lot of people in a lot of different situations would have had to have had these conversations and thought about it themselves before. And it's easy to kind of resent his, I'm not going to say naivete, because it's not so much that as just that he was able to ignore things, so he did, and the project drew some things to his attention. And that's fine. There isn't really a climax to this. He doesn't come to a grand reckoning. He just starts protesting more, which is fine. But it felt a little bit empty because there isn't that much to it. But I think people who are having the same kind of conversations that he is, who have been able to ignore things and have young children as he does and are working out that conversation, I think there's probably some value to that. The art in this, though, is fantastic. Everything's detailed. It's a similar style that he used in March, so you'll definitely recognize it if you've read those books. He draws his kids as anthropomorphic unicorns. Everybody else is a normal human. And it's kind of cute because it both gives them a bit of anonymity, but also a kind of innocence to them, which is sweet. So yeah, I liked this stylistically and I liked the idea of it, but it felt a little unsatisfying because it does feel like he's around my age, and I did feel like, you could have been thinking about this in 1992 when you were in high school. You didn't have to be thinking about this just now. He also does a lot of generational discussions that I don't believe in. He's a kind of late Gen X, and his parents are baby boomers, and he's very our generation, their generation, blah, blah. And I don't buy into the generational myth, but I think this will be an easier read for people who do, just as a data point. Another comic that I read was Whit Taylor's Montana Diary, which is mostly a travelogue. It is her and her husband traveling through Montana. They go to Glacier National Park, they stay in Whitefish, they look at hotels. The art is fairly simple, but captures northern Montana in a way that I thought was pretty charming. Back when I lived in Alberta, we did go there a number of times, so a lot of the places she was drawing were places I had been to, so I loved that. She does a little bit of sociocultural commentary. She's a black woman, her husband is a white man, and she has a lot of comments about how she thinks they're going to be and then how they are perceived as an interracial couple, which does kind of the American thing in which they say interracial, but it is a conversation about black and white interracial couples, and it has nothing to do with how people who are categorized any other way, or black plus any other, or white plus any other would be, which I just mentioned because having gone to Montana with a number of friends and in other configurations of interracial relationships, I did think this is less general than you seem to think it is. But I mean, that is how a lot of American writing on race is going to be. So I may be nitpicking just because I did a lot of traveling in Montana with people who fall into the category as described, but not as she means it, if you know what I mean. In any case, I think if you've been to Montana, there's some pretty mountain pictures in here, and it's worth it for that. But yeah, it's a short one, so I don't have a lot to say about that beyond that. Speaking of short, though, I read an even shorter book as well called Postcovid, which was written by an anonymous writer because they're a U.S. postal worker and still are, and it is a book that they wrote while they were on leave from work because they had COVID, and it's essentially an expose about how the postal system and also the communities that they work in were basically guilty of exposing them to a lot of COVID and not. And I mean, it's an interesting portrait of a worker's situation, but there's one point where the author comments that the artist that he worked with on the project is more interesting and has better things to say about everything. And I just thought, well, okay, that's kind of sells yourself short, but it was very much a listing of things happening. So maybe he's right and the artist was better. It was interesting, but yeah, there you go. And finally, I listened to an audiobook that was a celebrity memoir or a celebrity essay collection maybe, and that was Seth Rogan's Yearbook. Unlike a lot of celebrity memoirs, this, while it is narrated by him, it is also a full cast recording, so he has his own parents and his sister and his wife reading out their lines. At some point, he has celebrities that he talks about reading out their own lines. Sacha Baron Cohen plays himself in this. There are some bits where the celebrities are not people that would have joined in, and he has other actors and comedians doing those voices. So it is a lot of fun. It feels more like listening to a radio play than listening to an audiobook in a lot of ways. And so it was fun to listen to. And he talks about both his celebrity experience, being a writer and the actor, and also his childhood growing up in Vancouver. He talks a lot about drug use, and I think if you share that with him, it's probably more entertaining than it would be for me, because I am pretty much a boring teetotaler, so what are you gonna do? And I think if you're more of a fan of his work, it will be even more entertaining. I've seen Pineapple Express and The Interview and that kind of thing, but I wouldn't really necessarily call myself a fan of his. I just liked the idea of a full cast recording, and I wanted to see how that was because I saw somebody on Instagram talking about this. It was fun, and as I said, I think if you're a bigger fan of him or have more overlap in experiences with him, I think it will be even more entertaining. But yeah, that's our tonal bookend. Very depressing and very funny. There you go. Anyway, oh, and good. This is about a quarter of the length of the version of this I did before. Good work. Okay, if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought, and that is it for now. Ciao.